in some ways, you might say partially responsible for the mess that we find ourselves in, because it was during our next guest's ministerial career and his cabinet career that all these concepts were introduced. Is Dr. Michael Bassett, former Labour cabinet minister from 1984 to 90, I think, and I'll ask him in a second, he was one of the founding fathers of the ACT Party as well, and he certainly was formerly a well-esteemed, very respected historian, which is where I actually read some of his work long before I entered politics. And he joins us now for a discussion that we started last week. Michael, welcome to the show again. You would have heard that discussion with Gary Judd. You had some sort of connection with him.
I heard some of it. It took me just a wee while before I recognised the voice. I first met Gary Judd 60 years ago. He was a student of mine when he was studying for his law degree. He was doing the sort of general history component that in those days was part of a law degree. And I've known him closely for, as I say, 60 years. He was my lawyer at various stages.
Oh, very good. Okay. Listen, in some ways, as I said, I don't mean to hold you personally responsible, but if you guys had done your job between 1984 and 1990, we wouldn't be having these arguments, would we, Michael?
Well, I think the problem goes back a bit further before that. But again, I was in Parliament 1972 to 75, and to fulfil a promise that Norman Kirk had made to Maori, and more particularly to Matt Rata, who was the Minister of Maori Affairs, the Waitangi Tribunal was established in 1975. And the trouble was that Matt Rata was ill for a considerable period of time while he was minister, and quite a lot of stuff that really should have been considered before the bill was pushed through wasn't. Most particularly the reference to the principles of the treaty, which were just not defined. And that's where the confusion comes in. And what happened was that 10 years later, when I was a minister, by this time, the government backdated the scope of the things that the Waitangi Tribunal could explore, the historical grievances going back to 1840. But again, it just allowed the principles of the treaty to rest there unspecified. Well, it was inevitable that it was going to happen. Eventually, somebody says, well, what are the principles of the treaty? And in 1987, when the SOE legislation was pushed through, it included right at the tail end this little bit that Jeffrey Palmer put in the bill about the principles. Nothing that would happen under the legislation would be contrary to the principles of the treaty. Well, Maori took a case, and we got the judgment of the Court of Appeal, which where they talked, amongst other things, about Maori relationship with Pākehā being akin to a partnership. Well, of course, that, forget the akin. Maori don't listen to words that don't align completely with what they want. And so akin was pushed aside, and partnership was what they claimed the courts had decided. And so a whole new line of arguments about what the treaty really meant were developed in subsequent years. And you've now got, on the one hand, the treaty that was actually signed in 1840 as translated by Sir Hugh Carfrew. And on the other hand, you've got a bunch of new chums who have interpreted the treaty in a way which they claim was authorised by the Court of Appeal, but wasn't. And so the confusion mounts by the day, and nobody really knows what the principles of the treaty are, and that's why David Seymour would rather like to define them. And
you said in our last interview, Michael, you said that you were working on it, and obviously the whole is a very unstable situation towards the end of the fourth Labor government. Was that the reason it wasn't completed, or was it just not completed because
they had to go? I mean, after the Court of Appeal decision and Justice Cook's comments about things being akin to a partnership, there was a bit of a worry amongst the ministers that the principles of the treaty looked like they were going to get out of hand. Mm-hmm. And we actually, I think it was Longie's office, developed a brief sort of document as to what the principles of the treaty really were in the government's view. But instead of actually legislating it, it was issued, I think, as a press statement, and I don't think anybody took a blind piece of notice of it. If it had been legislated, it would have anticipated what David Seymour is rather belatedly trying to do now.
Yes, and that's the remarkable thing. I didn't realise until I did a little bit of research that about 20 years ago, there was a private member's bill, Michael, introduced into Parliament by the former New Zealand First MP, Doug Woollerton, which aimed to eliminate all references to the expressions of the principle of the treaty, the principles of the Treaty of Waitangi, and the Treaty of Waitangi, its principles from New Zealand statutes. Believe it or not, it was supported by New Zealand First Leader, well, you would believe it, Winston Peters came out and supported it and said that it's important that it be done. Here we are 20 years later. He would seem to have the opportunity this time to back David Seymour on that, wouldn't he?
Well, I'd have thought, but you know Winston and I know Winston, and you just don't know what to expect from one government to the next, one triennium to the next.
All right. Mind you, I do note that the Labor Party voted for that, to go to Select Committee, interestingly. At that time,
well, they should.
That was 20 years.
Everybody has an interest in becoming clear about what the principles of the treaty really are. Otherwise, it's just made up on the fly. It's really genuinely quite extraordinary what happens when you don't specify things. Well, look, we've got the treaty. It's there. It was accepted by the government. It was endorsed by Maori. It was endorsed by the Maori Queen, the Hugh Carfrew translation of it in 1990, the 150th anniversary. So it had lasted for 150 years. And it's only now that you've got all these people. I saw some rooster the other day who'd spent most of his life in Australia. His early life in Australia, came back to New Zealand and has decided that he's now an expert on the Maori language. And he thinks he knows better than Hugh Carfrew and better than than Aparata Ngata and the people who have translated and interpreted the treaty for, the better part of 180 years. He's now the expert. And he's only one of dozens that are floating around. And, Seymour's absolutely right that you've got to specify it in law as to what those principles are, or you get rid of, as Doug Woollerton would have, all references to the principles of the treaty. I think that might be a little harder to do.
Well, but having said that, and that's the problem, it seems to me, there are two problems, Michael. The first is that you've got to work out what the principles are. But then even after you've worked there, we've been discussing this morning in both our New Zealand universities and now in our New Zealand legal system, the principles, or if you like, whatever the definition of those might be, of the treaty are become apparent systemically. So it's extraordinary. Part of our universities now saying that they're treaty-led, or te tiriti-led, and the implications this has for science we were talking about this morning. And now the New Zealand Council of Legal Education getting its wish that from next year, every law student must, in actual fact, study tikanga Māori as part of their law degree.
Whatever that is.
Exactly. But, well, and there's the interesting thing. Who's going to define what tikanga Māori is?